Karl Rove's Secret Kingdom of Power. In it, he writes, undeniably, he's back. Talking about Karl Rove. He's reinvented himself. He's not merely Bush's brain. He's the man who swallowed the Republican Party as the maestro orchestrating the various super PACs. He's inspired the wealthiest people on the right to pony up what could amount to $1 billion and has created an unelected position for himself of real enduring power with no term limits. Karl Rove has become the ultimate party boss. Craig Unger, lay out his rise to power, his fall, and then his rise again.
Right. Well, I think a lot of people saw him as a creature of the Bush family, and then that was it, and then it was all over in 2008 when Bush left the White House, and that was not the case at all. And it's worth going back to how he got power back in the 1980s, and there was not much of a Texas Republican Party in those years, but partly because Texas had powerful conservative Democrats like John Connell and Lloyd Bentsen. So the big business people who normally would give to the Republicans said, well, why bother? We're getting what we want from Connell and Bentsen. Rove got around that by creating political action committees, and he took an issue that seemed obscure at the time, known as tort reform. It's giving the rights of people to collect in product liability cases. And he went to Philip Morris, who put him on his payroll, and to big pharmaceutical companies and so forth, and said, look, you guys risk billions and billions of dollars in product liability. Give a few million to my candidates, and we will take over the Texas Supreme Court, we'll take over the Texas legislature, we'll put George W. Bush in as governor, and we will save you billions of dollars. And he did precisely that. And he ended up he flipped the Texas Supreme Court was completely dominated by Democrats. It became completely Republican. And he ended up with some very loyal campaign contributors like Bob Perry, who's no relation to Rick Perry, Harold Simmons, and so forth. These are Texas billionaires, and they've stuck with him for about 30 years. So that's really the first phase. The key moment then came in 2010, and this was the Republican Party was in crisis, as it appears to be again today. And Michael Steele was chairman of the RNC, and you may remember in early 2010 there was an episode where Republican donors were being entertained at a lesbian bondage-themed strip club. And
in California.
In California, exactly. And partly as a result of that and other things, big money people just refused to give anything to the Republican Party.
And this is a time when the RNC was broke.
Absolutely, absolutely. It was also just after a landmark Supreme Court decision, Citizens United. And this opened the gateways for people to give unlimited contributions to super PACs. And so Karl Rove had a luncheon at his home in Washington, D.C. on Weaver Terrace. He had about 24 people there. These were the bigwigs, and it was sponsored by Ed Gillespie, who had been a former chairman of the RNC. And he came away with millions and millions of dollars, and this represented the birth of the super PAC of American Crossroads, Crossroads GPS, and so forth.
Now, before we go forward, I wanted to go back a little further to show Karl Rove's power during the Bush years, both in 2000, and then you devote an entire chapter to what happened in Ohio in 2004. And a lot of people might not remember this or might not have even known to begin with.
Right. Well, Rove did a lot of things that were sort of under the radar and that I think have enduring consequences, and they represent real threats to democracy. One of them was the U.S. Attorney scandal, and I think it was widely misunderstood. And this was became best known when 8 United States attorneys were fired for sort of not towing the Republican Party line. Now, in fact, to me, the real question is not what happened to the unjust firing of those 8 people. It's what about the other U.S. attorneys who were appointed by the Bush administration and were towing the party line? What were they doing? And what we see happening is that they were prosecuting Democrats, essentially. This is best came through best in, I think the most egregious case of this is in Alabama, and it's the case of former Democratic Governor Don Siegelman, who will probably, in early September, will face going to jail for 8 years. And I think this is one of the most egregious, unjust acts we've seen from the Justice Department.
I want to turn to former Alabama Governor Don Siegelman, who was found guilty in a 2006 corruption case. Critics say Siegelman was the target of a political witch hunt, in part orchestrated by former Bush administration Deputy Karl Rove. Democracy Now! Spoke to Siegelman about his case in early 2009. We asked if he believed Karl Rove was involved in his prosecution. Let's just go to his response.
I was brought to trial 1 month before the Democratic primary by Karl Rove's best friend's wife, who was the U.S. attorney in the Middle District of Alabama, on charges that the New York Times said have never been a crime in America. Grant Woods, who's was the Republican Attorney General from Arizona, said that they couldn't beat Siegelman fair and square, so they targeted him with this prosecution. We have sworn testimony from a Republican political operative, Jill Simpson, who said that she was on a conversation with my prosecutor's husband, who said that he had talked to Karl Rove, and Rove had spoken to the Department of Justice, and everything was wired in for the Department of Justice to pursue me.
That's former Alabama Governor Don Siegelman speaking to Democracy Now! In 2006. Siegelman is now appealing his prison sentence 3 weeks before he's scheduled to report to federal prison to complete a more than 6-year sentence.
Right. Well, I think Siegelman's absolutely right. I mean, it's not the prettiest part of the American political system, but it's sort of standard operating procedure that sometimes campaign contributors get political appointments. And in Siegelman's case, Siegelman personally got $0. He appointed a contributor to a non-paying state-appointed position. And if he's to go to jail, George W. Bush gave appointments to over 100 campaign contributors and was not prosecuted on any one of those. And it really has been standard operating procedures. Hundreds of ambassadors throughout the years, and one administration after another, have been campaign contributors. And what you see that happened, and this is really under Rove's aegis, is selective prosecution. And I think there's nothing more damaging democracy than when laws are applied only to one group. And as I began to research this, I saw that, you may notice that a mayor of Alabama was indicted or investigated. Mayor of Honolulu was investigated and just before an election. Mayor of Miami, mayor of San Francisco, and all in all, I found mayors of 12 major cities. There's Cleveland, Detroit, Portland, Oregon, New Orleans, Chicago, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Memphis, and Dallas. What do they all have in common? They're Democrats. They are governors and lieutenant governors from 5 states: Alabama, Hawaii, Michigan, New Jersey, and Maryland, and on, over 200 politicians. And 85% of them are Democrats. And I think there's no data to suggest that the Democratic Party is 7 times more corrupt than the Republicans.
But how do you tie this all to Karl Rove?
Well, there is the testimony, as Siegelman said, of a former Republican operative named Jill Simpson. And she testified before the House Judiciary Committee. Now, excuse me, Rove in GQ magazine said she didn't dare mention his name. His name is in it 0 times. I went back to the testimony. In fact, his name is in it at least 50 times. And and she explicitly makes it clear that he was involved. What happened with the Siegelman prosecution is a colleague of Rove's named Bill Canary was sort of the Karl Rove of Alabama. He was handling the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Republican senatorial candidates, and so forth, and who was appointed U.S. attorney in Alabama, but Canary's wife. So he was in this wonderful position. When he was running a campaign, his wife would simply indict the Democratic opponent. And that's exactly what happened.
So now let's go back to Ohio. In fact, Ohio and Smarttech, this is the one chance you ever had to question Karl Rove about that.
Exactly, and I met Karl Rove in Alabama, and I asked him, he said, Smarttech, what's that? I've never heard of it. Well, Smarttech is a high-tech company in Chattanooga, and what you see with Rove's methodology is he manages to have things happen in his benefit, and there are no fingerprints. But I traced the ownership of Smarttech and its precursors, and the original company was funded by its precursor, rather, was funded by two Republicans named Bill DeWitt and Mercer Reynolds. Mercer Reynolds was finance chairman of the Republican Party. In 2004, he raised about $250 million for the Bush-Cheney campaign. And in the 80s, they had bailed out George W. Bush in his oil ventures, DeWitt and Reynolds had. So they were very, very close to him. And this company started off as a very legitimate high-tech company in Chattanooga during the dot-com boom. It later reformed under a different name and different ownership. But by then, it had become very much a political operation. So this was a highly, highly partisan Republican high-tech company. It hosted, its biggest clients included the Bush-Cheney campaign. It included Jeb Bush. It included the Republican National Committee. It streamed live the convention, the Republican convention. And somehow or other, in 2004, in the state of Ohio, which was the single most crucial state in the Electoral College, when it came to the actual voting, the Secretary of State of Ohio, a guy named Ken Blackwell, and the Secretary of State's job is to, part of it is to ensure fair, nonpartisan elections, happened to be co-chair of the Bush campaign. Now, there's no conflict there. And he gave a contract to host the failover site for the Republican, for the votes in 2004, to none other than Smarttech. And this is where things went a little crazy.
But how is that allowed to happen, even? I mean,
well, I mean, I think it is a huge conflict of interest on the face of it for the Secretary of State of a party to be affiliated with one campaign or the other. And we saw it, of course, in Florida in 2000 with Kathleen Harris.
Well, 2004, election night. Tell us the story.
Right. Well, about at 11:14 p.m., things started to happen, exactly 11:14 p.m. And as the votes came in, it was clear it was going to be an all-nighter in terms of the results. And around 11 o'clock, Florida was called for Bush. And that meant the entire fate of the election hinged on Ohio. So suddenly, excuse me, the servers for the Secretary of State's computers were flooded
Ohio
with
Secretary
queries.
of State.
Exactly. And they needed to lock into the failover site in Chattanooga with Smarttech. And this is where the results went a little crazy. And suddenly, an enormous number of irregular returns came in, and the votes shifted. The exit polls had shown Kerry winning Ohio and therefore the election, and it looked like he had won the presidential election. I remember that day vividly because I was getting reports from the exit polls, and I went around telling people it looked like Kerry had won. But there was a 6.7% difference between the exit polls and the actual results. And as a result, the election ended up going to Bush, and that was the entire story.
In writing about what happened in Ohio as well as in Alabama, one of the things that you say about Rove is that a case can be made that for the last 3 decades he's been putting a systematic attempt to game the American electoral system by whatever means necessary. What kind of vision does Karl Rove have for the Republican Party and for American politics?
Right. Well, I don't think he's an ideologue. I think he's about winning, and he's often been compared to a guy named Mark Hanna, who more than a century ago was the political mind behind President William McKinley. He was a senator from Ohio, but he was also a political operative who put McKinley in the White House and forged a realignment. There's always been this talk of a permanent Republican majority that Rove is trying to forge, and he sees the nation as being entirely Republican. In fact, I think that's Rove's line, and I don't buy it. He faces, and the Republican Party faces, an extraordinary challenge with the Hispanic boom. There are now 50 million Hispanics in the United States. In 2020, at the current rate of growth, there'll be 70 million. If they start to vote, they tend to lean heavily Democratic, and you will start to see states like Texas and Arizona flip from red to blue. And Rove is trying to stop that, and one campaign he's supported is what is known as campaign fighting voter fraud. And as I found out, I think the fraud about the Brennan Center at the NYU School of Law says the fraud about voter fraud is itself a fraud. And there have only been 10 documented cases of people voting under false names in the first decade of this century. So why? But in response to that minuscule number, there are campaigns in more than 30 states to have require voter IDs and so forth. This will inhibit voting from new immigrants, from minorities, from the elderly and so forth, who again lean heavily Democratic.
Before we go to break, I want to go one more time back to Ohio, because you really focus on these issues in the book. Michael Connell, who he was and what his death meant.
Right. Well, he was known as Rove's sort of cyber guru, and he had a company called New Media that was hosted all its work at Smarttech, the company I mentioned earlier. And what you see there is, again, a highly partisan Republican operative who gets involved in what are supposed to be nonpartisan activities, and there were a number of things going on there. What first struck my attention is he got contracts to host the House Judiciary Committee, the House Intelligence Committee, a lot of government committees, which included emails and so forth of Democrats. And I thought back to Watergate, of course, when the Republicans broke in to get one file from the Watergate office. Here, they presumably had access to thousands and thousands of files for many, many years. Whether they used that or not, I don't really know. They were also, but Connell, one of the things that's very interesting is how evidence disappeared again and again and again in this case. And what you saw is that in all of these scandals, in the U.S. Attorney scandal and the Valerie Plame scandal, Rove's emails were subpoenaed, and they were hosted at Smarttech. And oops, millions of emails mysteriously disappeared. Now, these were supposedly under the protected by the Presidential Preservation Records Act. And the destruction of government documents is a very, very serious crime. But every attempt to investigate turns up not. And Mike Connell became increasingly an important witness in this case. He was subpoenaed once. There was a case investigating the 2004 election. He was supposed to testify again. And finally, before he could testify again, he died in a plane crash, in a solo private plane.
I want to ask you about Stephen Spoonermore, a former John McCain supporter and a highly successful expert at the detection of computer fraud. In 2008, he named Mike Connell and his company GovTech Solutions as having played a crucial role in the electronic subversion of the vote in Ohio in 2004. I want to ask you more about Spoonermore, but first I want to turn to a 2008 interview Democracy Now! Did with the media scholar Mark Crispin Miller shortly after Mike Connell died in a plane crash. In this clip, Miller says Connell asked Spoonermore how one would go about destroying White House emails.
Stephen Spoonermore is a conservative Republican, a former McCain supporter, and a very prominent expert at the detection of computer fraud. He's the star witness in the Ohio lawsuit, right, in which Connell was involved. He has done extensive work of this kind involving computer security and had therefore worked with Connell, knew Connell personally, and knew a lot of the people who were involved in the sort of cybersecurity end of the Bush operation. Despite his conservatism, or I suppose some would say because of it, he's a man of principle. I mean, he believes in the Constitution. He believes the election should be honest. He's the one who came forward and named Connell. And I have seen his notes of a conversation in which Connell asked Spoonermore how one would go about destroying White House emails. To this, Spoonermore said, "This conversation's over. You're asking me to do something illegal." But clearly, this is the important point, Mike Connell was up past his eyeballs in the most sensitive and explosive aspects of this crime family that has been masquerading as a political party.
That was Mark Crispin Miller speaking to Democracy Now! Do you think Ohio in 2004 was stolen, and do you think it's possible that something like that could happen in the 2012 election?
Well, there was no question there was massive fraud. If you want to actually count the votes, unfortunately, it's impossible because so much evidence was destroyed. And then that's why Mike Connell was such an important witness, and his death meant that, I quoted, I talked to Mike Connell's sister, who said, either there are only two possibilities, really, that Connell was murdered, and I don't see any evidence of that, or that he was in an accident, in which case Karl Rove was the luckiest man alive. Could this happen again? I think, I think electronic voting is very, very dangerous, and it's very easy to manipulate. But I also found evidence in Ohio of extraordinary kinds of fraud that could happen with punch card ballots as well, through very elaborate and Byzantine means of known as cross-voting. And I think a lot of people don't realize when you go into a voting booth and you see another voting booth nearby, if you voted the same way in the adjoining booth, in the wrong booth, or if your punch card is counted by the different computer, it would register to a different vote. And we saw that this happened.
I don't understand.
In Ohio, they have what is known as rotation of ballot. That is, they decide that whoever at the top of the ballot has roughly a 2% advantage over the candidate below him. So to compensate for that, they actually rotate the ballot sequence from one precinct to another, which makes a certain amount of sense. But the voter doesn't know that. Now, if
So you might have Romney on top in one ballot, Obama on top on another ballot.
Exactly. So precinct 1 has Romney on top. If it's counted by precinct 2, however, the vote goes to the wrong person. And we saw a lot of that in Ohio. And the giveaway was in an African-American precinct where there were third-party people on the ballot there, including a white supremacist, someone linked to a white supremacist party. And suddenly, in this African-American precinct, and African-Americans tend to be very, very disciplined Democratic voters. It had been 95% Democratic in the past. And suddenly, this man who was linked to a white supremacist got 40% of the vote. And you could see exactly what had happened.
We're talking to Craig Unger. His new book is Boss Rove, Inside Karl Rove's Secret Kingdom of Power. When we come back from break, how Karl Rove barely escaped indictment and rose to be the biggest powerhouse, political powerhouse in America today. Stay with us.